Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's great to see so many people here. Today, I'm going to share with you basically my lessons moving from startup environment to enterprise product management, and basically share the practical learnings that I had that you can apply to your day-to-day work. Those are very personal. I have a personal story with every single one of those, and this will be useful for some, not for everyone, but I hope that you can gain some wisdom from what I'm about to tell you today. It's not about fancy slides today. It's really about the practical experiences and stories, and essentially leaving you with things that you can apply right away in your day-to-day job. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first, I just wanted to introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm Gevorg. I'm product manager for past 7 years, and I've been in multiple companies and kind of had the different angles on experiences of product management. And just to give you a brief overview of my story, I started as a product owner at SFL, and SFL was an outsourcing company. We were about 100 people back in time. So it really was a fairly small company. And we were working with different clients from across the world for different sizes of the companies, basically, and we were delivering software products end to end for them. And then I moved to a company called Workfront, which was essentially a work management software company. I worked there as a product manager, and the company back in time was around 1,000 employees, so 10 times more than my previous company, which felt extremely huge at the time. But then I moved to Adobe after Workfront's acquisition. And you can imagine Adobe is 30,000 employees company. So huge, huge company compared to the others that I worked with and the others that I had experience with. And the reason I tell you all this is that I had different angles and I kind of operated in different sizes of the companies. So I kind of know from experience how it feels to be a startup, how it feels to be a mid-sized company, and how it feels to be an enterprise, huge company. Another fun fact about me, I'm based in Armenia, which is recently being called Silicon Mountains, which is super cool and fun place. If you haven't visited yet, I definitely recommend to have that experience or add that to your bucket list. So as PMs, we obviously all love agendas. Let's just cover what we're going to learn today. I basically structured the presentation to cover three main aspects of building a successful organization, having essentially sort of like a successful company. For me, it's that it consists of three main building blocks. So the first thing is building a team. And we'll deep dive about some of the experiences, and I'll leave it with 5 lessons that I've learned that you can apply for your team, essentially. Then we're going to move to talk about building an organization. We're going to cover some of the structures, some of the tips, and again, 5 lessons on how to actually build an organization that is efficient and essentially the one that accomplishes its goals. The third thing, and perhaps the most important thing for a lot of people, is building the culture. How do you actually create a company that people love, that people want to be at, and that you want to be at? So I'll leave you with a few of my lessons there as well. We'll wrap up things with the Q&A. So whenever you have any questions or any feedback, feel free to use chat, and I'll cover all those questions at the end of the presentation. So far, so good. Let's move forward. And we'll start with building the team. So for a lot of people, this is probably one of the core aspects of delivering and building a successful business. So if you think about it, a lot of early stage startups are based on personalities. So there are founders who are impacting what the team is, what the culture is at the team for quite a bit. But then one person can scale as much, right? So you really need to create a team that will be the backbone of your product. Because essentially it's people who are building the product and people who are building businesses. Unless you have a solid team behind your back, you're probably not going to last too much. You can be a self-starter, but that's not really enough to build a successful business. So building the team. We'll start by talking about a few aspects of hiring. How do you basically hire a successful team? How do you, bring the best people from the field? And my first lesson, which may feel like an obvious one, but I'll uncover and unpack every single lesson for you. So it's about always hiring top talent. Do not compromise on that at all. But you also need to seek for people who demonstrate curiosity and ownership. those are sort of like the personality traits that not a lot of people have, and those are critical for a product manager. I have not ever met a successful and accomplished product manager who did not demonstrate curiosity and ownership. And this is sort of like expanding beyond their work, but that's just who they are. That's just what type of people they are. And you need to be paying attention very closely during the interview and hiring process to make sure that the people you bring onto the team are demonstrating those things and those super important traits. What's really important to also acknowledge here is that obviously companies are going through different stages in their product, right? There is this first stage, which is drunken walk, where essentially you don't really have a lot of people. You're a super small team, and a lot of product decisions here are influenced by founders. So you're trying things, there's a little bit of turbulence, you're trying things, you're failing, you're trying to find something else, and it's a, probably a period where you don't really need a product team. Your founders can do just good enough. You probably need a bunch of engineers to make sure that you can build something, and founders are just enough for product managers in most cases. Then it's product fit. So you're searching for product market fit. You're essentially trying to build something that people want. And again, here it's super important to engage with founders, and the product managers that you are looking for at this stage are perhaps a bit more of project managers, because you probably don't have the lack of ideas, but it's rather that you would want to figure out how to deliver them quickly to the market and see the response and see whether that resonates with people. And again, the reason I'm telling you this framework is, despite all the specific skills that you would look for in product managers in different stages of your company, you at every single stage, you definitely need people who have high level of ownership and high level of curiosity. And then just to kind of wrap up this framework, hypergrowth, it's essentially where you found your product market fit, you're scaling super fast. This is usually where companies are becoming like adding hundreds of employees within a matter of months, just because there's so much to do. Your business is growing, you're getting probably investments, and you're just trying to build up on that success. Again, different types of product managers who operate a lot in uncertainty and are willing to change, because a lot of things are going to change. Inevitably, when your company is scaling 10, 20, 30, or perhaps 100 times, you will need people who will be accommodating change. And then the last thing is scaling. That's essentially where you already have a successful and stable business. And this is where you would probably look for people who are more visionary, because that's where you may want to look for some new markets, new opportunities, and essentially figuring out how you may want to grow your company. But again, the overarching theme here is that you definitely need people with curiosity and sense of ownership. All right, moving to the next one. The next thing is really important to internalize and accept, is that the first 100 employees that you hire will essentially define the next 200 employees. There's a fairly famous study, I think that was from Google, where their top performers were also referring and bringing to work other top performers. So at the same time, the interesting thing is that the people with low performance were actually bringing in low performers. So it's really important that you focus on hiring top performing talent, super cool people who will also attract and bring people like them to the company. Because again, similar people attract similar people. And if you are successful with the first 100 hires that you actually have, you'll probably be successful as a business moving forward, because those people will bring in other excellent people for your company. One of the things that is very important here is you need to pay close attention to your hiring process. And you need to also pay attention to the breaking points that you may notice at your hiring process, right? So a lot of people are thinking about hiring as like binary process, where you either hire people or do not hire, and it's just one single point of decision, which in reality it's not. You have this spectrum or this timeline where you have pre-hiring process, hiring, and post-hiring process, right? Pre-hiring is essentially when you are screening candidates, you're looking for people who fit your model, your business model, your organizational model, and at the same time, people who will bring in some new skills and will be able to compensate or correlate with whatever you are trying to build. Uh, a lot of the times, founders may essentially try to bring in folks who were successful somewhere else, but it's important to acknowledge that success somewhere else does not guarantee success at your company. And you really need to find this match where people were working in a similar industry, they are fitting with your culture, they're fitting with the business model, with the operating model. And when you see some sort of mismatch, that should already be a red flag for you to consider whether this is the right hire or whether I want to move this person forward to the hiring process. And primary reason for it is that when we move to hiring, hiring is extremely expensive process. You and your team are spending hours and hours just screening through candidates, having different types of interviews, spending hours in the interview process and post-interview process. So you need to make sure that you also take into account the costs of your recruiting process and the impact that the candidate will make if they are hired. Because if you think about it, hiring may take something like 6 months for a lot of roles, especially more senior roles, right? You might want to bring in people who would also be able to provide you a return on investment. Like the impact of the work that they are going to do should definitely be more than the costs of their recruiting. So you need to be paying attention on that. If something goes wrong within the interview process, if you feel like the candidate's impact will probably not match the costs that you're spending on just hiring and bringing those people on board, you might want to reconsider and you might want to stop the interview process for that particular person or that particular role. And then the other very important piece that a lot of people do not acknowledge or do not think about, that's the post-hiring. Because to be completely honest, is even though a lot of us think that we're pretty good at interviewing people, we can tell whether they're a good fit or they're not. In reality, is like generally people are pretty bad at interviewing, and it's really hard. It's really hard to know whether the person would be successful with your company after just spending a few hours with them. So for that, you really would want to keep an eye on your recent hires in their post-hiring period. And there are like generally three ways that they can fail. It's failing up, so essentially managing up, right? They are not successful with their manager, they are not successful with the CEO of the company, they're not successful with the executives of the company. If you're noticing anything there, that's probably a red flag that you may want to pay attention to. Failing down is essentially if they are not successful with working with their direct reports, their teams, and essentially people who may be down in the hierarchy of the company, right? Maybe lower level of the hierarchy. But if they are not successful with cooperating, collaborating, and delivering with them, that's again a red flag that you might want to pay attention to. And then there is failing laterally, essentially how successful people are with interacting with their peers, people who are holding the same position, doing pretty much the same job or similar jobs in different areas of the product, how successful their interactions are. And again, if you're noticing that there is something wrong there, something is broken, that's probably a good point for you to consider whether you want this person to be among the first 100 of your hires. Because again, hiring is a network effect. And if you're not successful with the first 100 of your hire, there's a high likelihood that the other people at your company may not be as good as they could be. And you're not building the company that you may be building if you were more attentive to this process. All right, moving on from hiring is, let's assume you already have your team. And what's really, really important is to make sure that you and your team are spending enough efforts and dedicating enough efforts to up-leveling your competence. And a lot of people are thinking about this in the generic terms, and a lot of people are thinking about this as you will grow just by doing your work, which is true to some degree. Obviously, while doing the work, people are getting more experience, they are understanding the market a little bit better, and they're having more context. But it's not enough. And you need to expand, and you need to essentially learn from different competences, and you need to learn from different experiences. And there should be some regular practice for you and your team and everyone else in the company, because that should become part of the culture, where constantly growing beyond just your regular work is an expectation. Uh, there are lots of different frameworks. There are fancy ones, there are more sophisticated ones and more structured ones. But one of the things that I personally love, and I personally always ask my teams to self-evaluate, and I self-evaluate myself, is the simple question: what's your superpower? You'll be surprised how many people do not answer this question or are having hard times just recalling what their superpowers might be. I would definitely recommend you spend some time just reflecting on this and just having the clear answer and being honest with yourself. What are the superpowers? What are the things that you are best at? What are the things that you are among top 5% of your company, right? At the same time, there is the opposite side of things, where if you know the Superman story, and there is a reason why I put Superman here specifically, is that in the very first editions, Superman was an invincible character, so no one could beat him. He was just unbeatable, and he was always successful, like 100% of the time. That kind of manifested that this guy is boring. Like, he doesn't have anything to improve upon. He's just winning all the time. There is no intrigue. There is nothing to improve upon. So the reason I bring this point is that you also need to try to find your own kryptonite. So, like, figuring out what are the things that you may be improving, what are the things that may defeat you. If we were using this analogy again, it's really important to be honest and clear with yourself and with your team what you think their superpowers are. Help them discover that, but also help them discover their blind spots. Once you have those answers, once you have that clarity, that's where you can start improving those things. But that will be not the general overarching theme of like self-improvement, which is too broad of a topic to really be able to improve upon, but rather you will just have clarity around what are the specific skills that you can improve and that will make yourself a better person or a better professional. That will help you bring in some clarity and some specific tactics on how to improve some of those and how to resolve those. Super simple question, but it's very difficult to answer. It's way more challenging than you may think. All right. The other thing is that a lot of people in larger companies specifically, and probably similarly in startups, are avoiding tough conversations. Just we as humans do not like tough conversations because no one likes conflict, and we're just trying to be nice. So we're trying to kind of navigate the team dynamics. We're trying to be respectful for everyone, but essentially, you need to make sure that people at your company understand that feedback is a gift. And a lot of people do not acknowledge this and do not look from the other side, but it's as difficult to provide feedback as it is to accept feedback. So make sure that you are not holding yourself back. And the more transparent and direct you are as an organization, the more successful you'll be. Best teams that I've seen have extreme level of transparency and kind of honesty among each other. It's completely okay to share some feedback, even though people may not like it. And probably a lot of people are familiar with the radical candor framework, but it's just too good to skip it, even though it's widely known. So the thing that is very important about feedback is that you need to make sure that whenever you are challenging people, you need to challenge them directly. So don't try to avoid challenging or being direct with people, but also you need to make sure that you're demonstrating care and you sincerely care personally about that person. So like, you want to make sure they are improving. That's the reason why you are providing feedback. You are not providing feedback to sort of make them feel bad or to sort of demonstrate aggression or manipulate them or something. People feel when you're not sincere. I've read the other day that it takes less than a second for people to read your facial expressions or to rate what's your intent. So you need to sincerely care about people. You need to sincerely try to make them better and be honest and very direct with them. I can guarantee you, in almost like 100% of the cases, when people are mature, they will just be grateful to you for the remainder of time, and they'll respect you more, because it takes a lot of courage to be direct and honest with people. So do not hold yourself back. Try to adopt this culturally, and be accepting of the feedback as well. Like, you need to be able to accept feedback as well. It's not a one-way kind of road. So you need to be ready for accepting feedback, and you need to ensure that your company understands that radical candor is part of the culture, and it only makes everyone better. There are literally no downsides to this. All right, lesson number 5, and perhaps the last one in this section, and we'll move on to organization. But it's surprising how many amazing, great product managers are super gifted in how they're managing their products, but they're fairly terrible in how they're managing their own career. And it's really important for people to acknowledge that their career is their responsibility. So they're not playing in RPC mode, and they're not playing like, second star kind of thing. They're rather accepting that they're the main actor of their lives. And the reason I bring this up is, like, a lot of people tend to blame their managers if something isn't happening, where they do not even know what they actually want. It's really important to get clear with your people that it's their responsibility to manage their career. And ideally, if they manage it as they're managing their products, there's high likelihood that they'll be very successful. One of the core choices that every PM at some point goes through is, and this is very relevant to smaller companies as well, because smaller companies tend not to have too many career ladders and opportunities. It's really important to design some of that early on in your company. So super important piece is IC or manager. At some point in your PM career, you will have that choice whether you want to move towards being a people manager, a person who is spending most of their time in the problem space, versus being the person who is spending most of their time in the solution space. That is where senior individual contributors come in, where you're having a ton of complexity to solve, you're becoming a specialist in solution space, and you're really understanding how to navigate and solve some of the harder problems in the world. Whereas when you're a manager, you're responsible for developing your team, you're responsible for finding the right problems to solve, and you're responsible for setting the grand vision for the company. And one other thing that is very important to acknowledge here, it's completely okay to change your directions and to navigate different paths. You do not have to stick with just a single one. But at least what you have to know, or you need to think about, is what's your next best desired step. Where do you want to go next is one of the most important questions you have to ask yourself. And if some of you who are listening are managing people, or trying to help some of the more junior people to navigate their career, or trying to build some of the career ladders, you need to make sure that it's very clear for all your employees where do they want to go next and what's their desired goal. Ideally, I would recommend to also have like a 5 years goal or like 3 year goal, because essentially it's very important to also have something that is more longer term, because that would influence some of the decisions that they may make along their progression, and some of the skills that they may want to up level to make sure they're successful with whatever they're trying to accomplish. All right, that was it for building a team. I hope you have a few, at least, thoughts on how to make your team better, and hopefully those were practical enough for you to consider them and apply them sometime soon. It's, again, those are the things that I lived through, and I had all of those in my experience. Okay, now building organizations. So organization is all about efficiency and how you actually get things done, right? A lot of the time there is this saying that people are not leaving companies, they are leaving bad managers and whatnot. But in reality, people are leaving inefficient organizations as well, where sometimes it's more painful and difficult to get things done than to not care about doing that at all. So what you want to make sure is that as you grow from startup to a larger company, or like to a mid-sized company, you want to make sure that your organization scales efficiently as well. For that, there are a few things that I wanted to share. So the first thing is designing organizational structure that minimizes dependencies while keeping teams informed about each other's work. A lot of people in the larger organizations would now understand what I mean by this, because I can tell you there were countless times that I've heard people complaining about there's somewhere some other team that is doing exactly the same thing that we were trying to do. There are lots of duplicative efforts across the board, especially in larger companies. I can guarantee you there's a lot of wasted effort. What you want to make sure is that your teams are in sync, and the way that you structure your organization actually helps them, right? It accelerates their work and improves their impact instead of just being a blocker or a dependency or something that is making it more difficult to make stuff done. So there are generally like four types of team models. You can obviously mix and match and find the better fit for yourself. But in reality, like if you think about the general categories, there are probably four of those. The first one is that you see on the left is more about outsourcing type of model, where essentially there is a CEO or a product manager that works with another product manager, usually referred to as product owner, where you're basically giving your requirements away and they're going in and making sure that things are being delivered with their engineering teams. In this case, this works for outsourcing products just fine. I would not generally recommend this model because it does not really create this empowered product team. And the agency PM and designer in this scenario are usually struggling quite a lot because they do not have as much the decision authority. They're rather just making sure that the things are implemented properly. In a lot of ways, that just feels like project manager role rather than product manager role. But it works for outsourcing and some of the other successful business models. It all depends on what you are trying to accomplish, right? Model number two, it's something that I've generally seen more in the older and more bureaucratic type of companies. But in essence, there is the waterfall type of process. There is designer, a product manager, who are defining some sort of requirements and features and goals for the coming year, 2, 3, 5, like whatever. It depends on the type of business that they're trying to build. And then once they're good with their requirements, they're just passing that over to delivery manager, and then delivery manager is handling the execution with their engineers. There's not much involvement from PM from that point on. Once they have handed over the requirements, that's where basically the work ends for them. They're not usually tracking that much the delivery process itself. It's just almost like ends and at the point where you are done with the requirements, which works for some companies. There are fairly successful companies built in from the past, or you may have something very, very specific. Like if you're building a rocket ship, there aren't many iterations that you may want to go through. You'll just have it, already upfront for its entirety. Then there's model number three, which is shared resource product teams. Usually those teams have their dedicated product managers, technical leaders, engineers, but they'll have some resources that are shared. That can be program managers, designers. Usually that's designers, to be very honest. That works just fine, but you need to be very careful not to have this almost like contractor type of relationship with your designer, because you want to make sure that those shared resources are still touched and dedicated to getting the work done and getting it done from the user problem perspective as well, not just basically completing the work and moving on. They need to feel like they're also owning the problem space as well. Then there is the fourth model, which is something that you will see in most of the kind of trendy companies these days, is the squad style product teams. That is essentially the product teams that are self-sufficient, so they don't really need anyone from the outside world to deliver whatever they're trying to accomplish. They already have their product managers, technical leads, designers, program managers, engineers, quality assurance. So essentially they're self-sufficient. They are autonomous teams that can deliver value, and they don't need anyone from the outside world to sort of help them out or add resources or do anything. This is the model that I've seen work best. But again, it's important to acknowledge that there are different types of models, and it's not just one size that fits all. you really need to be careful with what it is that you are building. And then another very important question that a lot of people are asking, especially as you scale, right? It's when does a reorganization make sense? Because as you can imagine, reorgs are annoying a lot of the times, even though they may be clearly beneficial in the longer run. People do not like change all that much, and you need to be really thoughtful and considerate when do you want to change your organization structure. A good rule of thumb is whenever your product strategy and your org chart are misaligned, whenever your organizational chart is inefficient in delivering on your product strategy, that's where you may want to consider reorganization to align better with your product strategy. Usually, the best practice that I've heard from a lot of startups that are scaling, or mid-sized companies, or even at the larger companies, is that they're trying to evaluate every year whether the current structure makes sense. And they're having a very honest and difficult conversation at that time to really determine if they want to change something in how organization is run. You don't have to change the entire organization, by the way. You may just want to change some particular business unit and restructure it or make it different for accomplishing your product strategy. And the other piece is like your product strategy should not change all that often. If it does, it's probably not super good strategy, because strategies are typically just sticking for some time, unless there's some market change, some new insight, or some growth that you were not anticipating or were anticipating. And then that's where you may want to have the conversation of changing your org structure to better align with your direction. All right, another thing that you may have heard over the internet for quite a while, and this is very trendy these days, it's about prioritizing outcomes over outputs, which sounds amazing on paper, although there is one caveat that a lot of people forget, and sometimes that just makes the crucial difference. It's that you need to be clear what artifacts are required and what it is that you're dropping. Because a lot of the times teams are thinking about outcomes in more of a fancy term, and they're like, well, we don't care about the outputs, we don't care about the inputs, we just care about what the outcome is, which may be true to some degree, but you need to make sure that you understand from on the deep level what it actually means switching to outcomes, right? And a good framework and a good sort of like table that you can use to explain this is that what product and engineering teams are doing is they're doing projects. They're basically delivering projects. Those projects are changing the product. So that change in the product is supposed to drive some sort of change in customer behavior. That may be increase of some metric, that can be decrease, that can be changed in some behavior that customers are doing, right? That can be financial, that can be in some different metrics. But in essence, you need to be sure that you are delivering on projects, you're actually changing something, and those changes are applying to the product and they're driving change in customer behavior. You need to make sure that people are not treating change to owning the outcomes just to be like, the fancy kind of metric driven kind of thing. There still needs to be quality input. There still needs to be a lot of time spent in understanding the customer problem and the feasibility of the solutions that you're trying to build. It's not just, sort of like, well, the outcome is the only thing that matters. Of course, that's very important. But you also need to make sure that the way to get to an outcome is also defined and clear, and people understand what the expectations are. Because a lot of the time that just creates chaos in the organization, where people are just dropping some of the older things that they're doing or older processes without having a clear understanding of what is expected of them. And operating in that uncertainty is not always the best thing to do. So you need to be very, very careful with this. All right. This is actually inspired by some of the recent conversations that had happened after Figma conference, where Airbnb's CEO kind of explained what their organizational changes are. So what's really important is a lot of the times managers, especially new managers, are claiming that they are not micromanaging, because micromanagement has this sort of like negative connotation and negative tag where no one wants to be a micromanager, right? which is true. And the true definition of micromanagement is prescriptively telling people what to do. Like whenever you're just telling them what to do, that probably is not good, because whatever you're paying them, you're probably paying them too much. But what's really important is, if you're not micromanaging, you need to still be in the details. You need to still understand what's happening with your product. Because if you don't really have the details, how do you know if they're doing a good job? It's very arbitrary at the time. And without really understanding what's happening, without really having a handle over the details, you probably won't really ever know what's true and what's not, and how your product and how your teams are actually performing. So do not overstep, do not micromanage, do not tell your team exactly what to do, but make sure that you know what's happening, you know the details, and you understand essentially the nuances of your product, because that's really important. All right, the next thing is about value delivery. So a lot of the times there is this fancy thing that is CI/CD, continuous delivery, continuous development, and all of that, right? Where people are releasing code constantly to production, they are making it available to their customers. But one thing that a lot of organizations miss as they scale is that releasing code and releasing products are very different things. And you need to be optimizing for the latter. And the reason I say so, as your company grows, as your customer base grows and becomes more mature, even though you may feel like customers would love new features as soon as possible and all of it, it's just partially true. And especially for B2B products, enterprise products. The reason I say so is, even though you are delivering some new capabilities, there is a pretty big change management that is happening within their organization when you release new things. And a lot of the times when you ask customers what would they want, constant changes and new features and new value versus stability and predictability, I can guarantee you in majority of the cases, people would prefer stability and predictability. So what's really important is, apart from releasing code, you need to focus on what's the value and what's the story behind the product that you're delivering. Because like, you can always deliver code, but people would not even understand what it is. And you, as a product manager, you also need to think about, well, this is the code, this is the feature, this is the capability. That's cool, that's all good. But how are we going to tell customers what it actually does? How would customers realize the value of it, right? Or if you're more of the sales-driven organization, how do you want your salespeople to talk about this feature? How do you want them to explain value to the customers, right? Because they're typically the people who are interacting with your customers day to day, or potential customers. If those people who are supposed to sell the value are not sure themselves what the value is, well, you can release every day, you can unlock amazing features every day, but features that no one ever discover or use or understand are just another piece of code that should never exist in the first place. So think about your release process, standardize that as soon as possible, because that will pay off in a big way over the longer term. And think about, how are you actually delivering products, not just releasing code or delivering software. It's all about the experiences, it's all about enablement, it's all about clarity on what the customers will get after this thing is delivered and enabled. So focus on value delivery. That's very, very important. And the last lesson in this section is all about establishing your way of communicating within your organization. So every organization has their own way of communicating. Whether they accept it or not, every company has some sort of preference. So some companies are more like verbal or speaking based, right? So if you're a great speaker, if you have some charisma, you can be pretty successful at those types of companies, because you'll be able to explain, communicate, and talk through whatever you're trying to build or whatever you're trying to envision. In some cases, there are companies like Amazon, and Amazon is super driven by writing culture. So there are these famous stories about executives getting in the room at Amazon. Everyone has their A4 paper with the brief of the meeting, with the proposal for the meeting. so that everyone just silently reads, and only then they're having the conversation or they're having the discussion. Whoever has not read the pre-read or the things that you hand them over right away during the meeting, they're not allowed to speak. They're not allowed to share their opinion because they don't have the same context as everyone else in the room. So I just really recommend, and that's what a lot of companies are failing for, they're not establishing what's their communication style. And obviously, I'm not saying you need to be on the extremes of this. It's not like if writing is your culture, you're not ever speaking at your company. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is there should be some preference, and you need to be clear with your new employees, your colleagues, your teams. What's the way of successful communication in your company? And I outlined my general preference there is writing, because I feel like, or in my experience, writing has been less biased, where uh, points are not going to like the louder person in the room, but rather everyone has the same chances, I guess. And obviously, there's good and bad writing, there is better one or worse one, but still, it just provides some more level of objectivity, and people are generally more structured when they write some things instead of just when they're speaking. Sometimes they may be improvising or whatever. So anyway, I would recommend sticking to writing as the general culture, but what's more important is that you have to establish what's your communication style. And again, I'll leave you with a quote here. Jeff Bezos kind of said what I tried to translate to a degree is like, if you wanted to clarify your thinking, remember something important, or communicate something clearly, write it down. That always helps, and I would definitely recommend you do some of their techniques if you haven't tried working backwards. I can guarantee you that may be a game changer for you. All right, let's move to the last section, and then we'll move to Q&A. So building a culture. The way that I like to think about building a culture is sort of paraphrasing what Paul Graham famously said at Y Combinator. So he said, the essence is build products that people want, or build something that people want. And I feel like it applies to companies pretty well as well. Essentially, culture is that you want to make you're trying to make companies people want, because like people, I mean, obviously, if you think about companies, right, there are some companies that you just kind of like from the outside, and there are companies that you do not like so much. So there's something special about companies with great culture. Sometimes they're saying that culture is something that happens when you're not in the room, and I agree with that largely. But in essence, it's just about how you operate, how you communicate, how you collaborate, what's tolerable, what's not. It's way more deep. And quite honestly, I'm not a big fan of like values written on the paper or put on the walls like posters and stuff, because essentially it's how you behave, how you act, and how you demonstrate the values of your company and the culture of your company. Because just posters won't make it. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is culture is super important, because culture is what makes people want to stay with your company and what makes people want to work for your company. Otherwise, the other parts won't just fit in, and people just won't stay at their company, because work is super important part of the life, and you wouldn't want to waste that at a company that you are not belonging to. All right. A few things that I will share with you are some of them are more tactical. Some of them are about establishing the collaborative culture within your engineering counterparts or within your organization in general. So one of the things that I definitely recommend, and that establishes part of the culture as sort of like collaborative, is the concept of universal backlog. So whenever you're a product manager, and what I observed in many companies is like there's a separate backlog of like product related things and features and capabilities that you may want to build. There's a separate backlog of like technical tasks, which are like infrastructure modernization, some technology modernization and stuff. And those things are just different backlogs. What it ends up being is like sometimes in the companies where product managers are sort of like more dominant, technical tasks are not getting as much priority. And engineering people are frustrated because they're like, well, our product won't scale if we don't do those things, and I can't explain this to my product manager. I can convince them because they're always like just pushing their product and customer facing features forward. In other cultures where engineering is predominant, they may just take most of the capacity for modernization, and then product features and capabilities won't get as much attention. What I've observed works best is it doesn't matter what type of backlog and features those are. What really matters is the value and the priority, because you need to be rigorous in your prioritization, but you also need to have some sort of model that would be fair, right? Or that would measure the impact. So in essence, what I'm trying to say is like, you don't need separate backlogs. You only need one. And that one backlog should include every single thing that you're trying to do. And those should be in priority order, no matter whether those are technical, those are product, those are tactical, like whatever. Just have the most important things outlined. That would make sure that there's clarity in your organization or your team, and people understand why certain decisions are made. Because otherwise, it will be product versus engineering, not product and engineering or any other business function that you may think of. So think about that, try to combine the backlog and make sure that everyone understands why certain things are getting in priority or they're not, right? You need to be very clear and very cautious of this. The second thing is about alignment. And what's really important is what I've observed is in most organizations, teams are basically the projection of their leadership. So it's where you're seeing that engineering managers, product managers, and let's say designers are not aligned. You would never see their engineering teams to be aligned or their product teams to be aligned, because unless there is alignment on the leadership level, there won't be alignment on the team level. And the reason I say so is if they're hearing conflicting messages, if they're feeling like there is some misalignment, they won't be comfortable with the decisions that you're making, and they won't fully trust you, because they'll be like, well, I don't know, this thing may change because those guys don't really know what they're trying to do. They're disagreeing, they're not aligning, and all of it. What you want to make sure is that you as leadership are never giving inconsistent messages. You are never like, if you're having a meeting for alignment, you're never going out of that meeting and giving inconsistent messages to your team. Doesn't matter whether all of you are present in those meetings or you're having separate conversations with team members. The message should always be the same. Unless that's in place, you will unlikely get teams commitment and essentially get teams trust. Pay very close attention to alignment and make sure that everyone is on the same page. The third thing that I've observed, again, and this is from personal experience as well, sometimes some people are, and especially when startups are trying to scale, they're trying to bring in some of the practices that are, there's initially there's chaos, and then people are looking at some of the more successful companies, larger companies, they're seeing that there's a lot of processes, and they're bringing in some fancy framework to be applied or fancy methodology to be applied for the team, which usually does not work when you're just applying that as prescribed, right? Every single company is different, and every single team at the company is different. And they need to be able to have some sort of flexibility in what it is that they are trying to build and what it is that works for them. So what I'm trying to manifest here is like, you do not need to just copy someone else's process or blindly follow agile methodology. You need to develop the framework, which can be hybrid, can be anything that just works for your team's specific needs. As long as there is a process that empowers your team and makes them more productive and successful, you don't need to apply anything really. So be careful with that. Don't over follow the process and methodology, because those frameworks are just in place for you to adopt and manipulate as you see fit. Those are not just prescriptive to exactly follow rules one by one. Make sure you're not overcomplicating things. You're solving things for your team. Number 4 is, it may feel kind of too straightforward and too simple, but it's actually pretty deep. So it's about establishing a routine where the team is reviewing key metrics daily. And it's not just about the numbers, to be honest, it's about context. So if you want to be successful as product team, you first of all need to get credibility at your organization. People need to know that whenever you're saying something is not an assumption, it's not a gut feeling, it's something that you know because you have the context, you understand the customers, and you understand how they are using the product or what they're using product for. And for that, you need to have consistent routine as part of your culture to really care and understand what's happening with your product. Because, if people are just watching and looking for metrics like once a week, once a month, or like occasionally, they won't have that much attachment to the product, and they won't have the full clarity of what it is that what's happening with their product, right? Because even a small change in a metric can kind of provide some insights that may inform some of the critical decisions you have to make. And you need to make sure that everyone on your team is doing this daily ritual. It doesn't have to be long. It just needs to be part of the culture. Because imagine that if there is a new joiner coming to your company and they are noticing this culture of reviewing the metrics and being serious about the metrics, being serious about customer insights, guess what they're going to do? They're going to follow the same pattern and they're going to embrace the same culture. And now you already have a more efficient organization and more efficient culture. So please make sure that you're paying attention to this. Even though this may feel like a fancy lesson, it's really powerful when you really deeply understand why you're doing this and not just setting up another meeting in the calendar. So please inject this to your team's DNA, and that will pay off over the long term. So now we're down to the last one. So the last one is really about ensuring that whenever you're setting some goals or setting directions, you are engaging the teams there and they feel their contribution to the goals. So, because otherwise they will just remain some random guys' goals, but not really theirs. And if you don't really want to have input to a degree from anyone, right? It's not like it should be a consensus and everyone should be happy with the goals, because goals should be challenging, they should be aspirational, they should be inspirational. But what's really important is that everyone understands how they contribute to the goal. And that should be a part of the culture. Because unless people really understand that, there won't be emotional connection and attachment, and people won't really sort of like row in the same direction. They'll just be there to complete the work, and that's it. So please be attentive and be empathetic, because as you can imagine, everyone wants to contribute to a greater vision, to a greater goal, and you as the product managers have the opportunity to basically empower people with that, right? So be attentive to everyone's contribution, acknowledge everyone's contribution, make sure that they understand how their work connects to the grand vision. Because again, otherwise you'll just have a team that is not motivated, that is not interested in what's happening with your company, and essentially you'll be almost like alone in the dark, which is not a fun place to be, and that is not a fun company to work for. And you have the power to change that as long as you are paying attention to some of the signals. All right, now we're at the Q&A session. I've talked for a lot, and hopefully these lessons were helpful to you. And if not right now, I can guarantee you as you mature in your career, they'll resonate and they'll make sense over the longer term. So hopefully some of the things are going to be applicable today. Some of the things may be applicable over the long term. It's just that you need to pay attention to some of the things that I've shared. And yeah, hopefully that's going to be useful. Let's see if there are any questions in chat. Oh, wow, there are quite a few. Okay, thank you. So the first one is from Alex. As startup grows, how do you keep everyone on the same page in different teams with product vision, like any hacks or tools or something? This is a great question that everyone is asking. That's like $1 million question. So the truth is that you need to make sure that, first of all, your vision is clear and everyone can understand that. You do not need to go for anything fancy or anything too difficult. You need to just stick with the things that are easy to explain and that make sense and resonate with people. So that's number one, right? You need to have crisp and clear product vision. Otherwise, it won't make sense. No one likes super, super difficult or fancy stuff that doesn't have anything behind it, right? So that's number one. The other things are you need to be constantly talking about your product vision. You need to be and especially as a product manager, as a product leader or CEO, you need to be the evangelist of your product vision, and you need to constantly talk about that. You need to constantly inject that vision so it becomes the part of the DNA of your company. So in essence, it's craft simple and clear and understandable product vision that is also inspiring and aspiring. So it should not be simple in that sense, right? It should not be something that you can accomplish within a week. It should be long-term vision that everyone can understand. So that's number one. And also you need to keep it consistent for some time, because if you change it every few months, that's probably not a good vision. That's not a good reason for joining your company or your team. So that's number one. The second thing is always talk about it, right? And socialize that so that everyone understands it. And yeah, the third one is really be consistent. Just keep it up and people will understand it. Okay, cool. Hope that answers your question. So the other one is from Pete. Hey, how do you adopt your product strategy to sync with changing market trends and customer insights? Well, I think that's partially inspired by AI. And, if I would tell that things are not changing all that fast, that would be a lie during this period, right? So in essence, you need to always explore, and you need to be open to change in that regard. If there's something major happening that will change the markets, change the industry, which, by the way, does not happen very often, right? It happens like every 5, 10 years, maybe 20 years. We're just happy to be in the technological progress that no one has ever seen before. So keep an eye on that. Make sure that you see the trends, that you follow the trends, and also make sure that you're open to changing that whenever that makes sense. But also make sure that you are not falling into the kind of false trends, if that makes sense. Because sometimes, people are just excited about things for the sake of those, because they're cool and fun and like whatever. But in like few weeks or a few months, no one actually remembers that thing that came. So make sure that you're open, you're looking for trends, you're looking for insights, but at the same time, be cautious that things may change and things may be false and fake. So that's for that. Hopefully that helps. There is a question from Eve. Any tips for startups on how to balance resources between developing new features and maintaining what they already have? Again, super cool question, very good question. The balance, if you are looking for an answer of like, keep the balance between 50% or where I would give you advantage, that's not true, because that will depend on how you are, what's important for your company at that point in time. You'll need to figure out what's the opportunity for each feature, meaning that whether adding something to existing features will bring your customers, your users, more benefits, or there is a new feature that if you develop, there's going to be some significant opportunities. Essentially, the question that you need to answer yourself before making those decisions is, why do you want to do certain things? So if you develop new feature, particular feature, not just general category features, what would that impact? Or maintaining what's already there. It's essentially coming back to my recommendation for using a single backlog. Like within a single backlog, you can maintain the particular items that you want to cover, and doesn't matter whether that's new feature or maintaining something existing. Just stick to a single backlog, prioritize that fairly with some framework in mind, with some objectivity in mind, and that will solve your problem. All right, there is one from Helena. Following on previous question, can you share some effective ways to prioritize product features when resources are tight? Again, one of the important things is it's not a prioritization until it hurts. So if you have a list of priorities which has like hundreds of items, that's not really prioritization. You need to have top 3 things, top 5 things, at most top 7 things that you need to work on. And it depends on the criteria of like what it is that you're trying to accomplish as a company. But you can think about general categories like what metrics are important for you and which features would have the most impact. So like it may be that for your product, the most important thing is stability or like availability, uptime. Then you know how to drive that metric and what would impact that metric. Or there can be like new revenue is the most important metric for your company. And then you're figuring out what among your features are impacting those metrics the most, like which has the most potential to bring in more revenue. And having that clarity, like what's the most important thing for you, what are the most important metrics or outcome, that will just help you essentially get our clarity and make those decisions. All right. Thanks, Helena. There's a question from Chicom. In my experience, user feedback in the product cycle always cause delays. Is there a way for startups to still include it into product development without slowing things down too much? Well, I would argue with user experience, like customer feedback, slowing things down, because essentially it should be a combination of things, right? You should have some sort of measurements that are more objective, and you should have customer feedback as well. But what's really important is just try to ask yourself what would be the fastest way to figure out whether things are working or not. Like the purest, fastest way. I can guarantee you, if you would say that it takes a few weeks to get customer feedback, I can bet there is a way to get that faster. I can bet there is a way for your customers to provide you feedback within a day of your release. And the way that you do that is by preparation. So if you really want a feedback about the feature that you're enabling, you can just pick like 5, 7, 10 of your customers, give them a heads up before the release. And again, remember what I told about the value delivery. You need to think about product release, releasing the product, not releasing code. And then you just can get in touch with them and ask them to, you know what, like we're releasing this thing tomorrow and I would really need your feedback within the first 24 hours. Are you willing to do that? And then, I mean, you just gather the feedback and that's it. You have feedback within the first 24 hours. That's already good enough feedback for essentially moving forward, right? It may not be the super deep feedback or anything that would be sort of like game changing because it may take time, but it will at least help you validate the hypothesis and give you direction what to do next. And that should be pretty much enough. And you can, cut that time down even further. But, that's just the rule of thumb or knee-jerk reaction on how you can handle some of those things. All right. There's Alex. Thanks for making it clear. One more from me, please, about lesson number 3. What regular practices do you suggest for growing competence among the team? That's a very good question. What's really important, again, in the growing competence thing, besides understanding what it is that you want to grow, what your superpowers or your weaknesses, it's also really important to understand what's your learning style. So in essence, you can be a person who learns by reading or listening to like podcasts or like whatever. You can be a person who learns by doing things and trying things, or you can be the type of person who can essentially learn by shadowing someone who is doing that thing that you want to learn. So like, if you're a public speaker, for example, right? You want to improve your public speaking skills. If your learning style is like reading or listening, you may want to read books about public speaking, charisma, presentations, how to structure presentations, and things like that, right? If you're a doer, you can basically try to sign up for different open lectures, small talks, or like whatever, where you can give presentations in almost like safe environment where, you can just gain some things by experience. Or if you're the person who likes to shadow things, you may just want to find someone at your company or anywhere else that you feel like is a great public speaker and just ask them, what do they do? Like, how do they get there? Or, trying to help them prepare a presentation or be with them at a public talk or something to just observe what do they do and sort of learn from their experiences. I hope that's helpful. That's just, a framework for you to apply when you're trying to prepare some learning path for you or your team. Pete, thank you for the question. I appreciate that. And there is one from Dimitri. What KPIs do you find most valuable for tracking product management success in a startup environment? there's not one size to fit all, to be honest, in this. The way that I would structure, it's really about perhaps, or this might be my recommendation, there should be some metric about your uptime. So like, how does your product satisfy performance needs, stability, and things like that, right? The other category would be perhaps user acquisition or customer acquisition, essentially the financial metric on the ARR. So like, how do you keep the product stable? How do you bring in more customers? And how do you make customers adopt your product? So some sort of like utilization or adoption metrics. Among those three major buckets and categories, you'll probably be able to navigate what's more relevant to your particular case. But that's like the frame of mind that I would recommend applying there. Awesome. Thank you. I think we've covered all the questions. That was long. Thank you so much for all the questions, all the engagement. It was my pleasure to share all these things with you. And if you would want to stay in touch, here is my LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect, happy to chat. Thanks for being here again. And hopefully this was useful to you. That's it for today. Thank you so much.